Wade Jensen had given up on finding love after 37 years of watching tumbleweeds blow past his empty cabin. Emma Sinclair's mail-order bride dreams died in a wagon rut when claim jumpers murdered her intended groom and left her broken in the Kansas rain. When Wade finds Emma bleeding and defenseless on that storm-lashed April night, neither expects the desperate marriage proposal that spills from his lips in the flickering candlelight of Dry Creek Crossing's tiny chapel, with the killer circling back at dawn and no lawman for 50 miles. Emma accepts Wade's protection through holy vows that feel more like a business contract than a wedding. But when the outlaws target Wade's ranch as their next prize, Emma's theater-trained mind becomes their secret weapon deciphering the thieves. Coded maps while Wade's rifle keeps them alive through the longest night of their lives. But could a marriage born from pure desperation somehow become the truest love either had ever known? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Flint Hills stretched endlessly under an April sky the color of old pewter. Their rolling grasslands, broken only by limestone outcroppings, it jutted from the earth like the backbone of some ancient beast. Wade Jensen had ridden these same trails for 15 years, ever since he'd scraped together enough coins to buy the failing ranch from a widow who couldn't bear another Kansas winter alone. Tonight, as his horse picked its way carefully along the muddy creek bottom, Wade felt that familiar weight settling on his shoulders, the weight of a man who'd built his life around solitude and was finally beginning to question the wisdom of that choice. At 37, Wade carried himself with the easy grace of someone who'd spent more hours in the saddle than on his own 2 feet. His weathered hands held the reins with unconscious skill, while his eyes swept the darkening landscape, searching for the half-dozen steers that had wandered off during yesterday's brief but violent thunderstorm. The cattle were probably holed up in one of the box canyons that carved deep gullies through this part of the territory, waiting out the aftermath of what the old-timers were calling the worst drought in living memory. The Winchester rifle that rested across his saddle horn had belonged to his father, the only inheritance Wade had received before the orphan train carried him west at age 8. He'd learned to shoot with that rifle, learned to hunt and defend himself during the lean years, when kind families were scarce and work was the only currency that mattered. Now the weapon felt as natural in his hands as breathing, though Wade sometimes wondered what his father would think of how his son had turned out. A bachelor rancher with more debt than cattle, talking to his horse because there was nobody else to listen. The rain had started again an hour ago, a steady drizzle. That turned the trail into a ribbon of sucking mud and made his horse snort with displeasure. Wade pulled his slicker tighter and nudged the gelding forward, following the winding creek toward the place where it crossed the main wagon road. If the steers had drifted that far, they'd leave tracks in the soft earth that even this weather couldn't wash away completely. Miles to the east, in a world that might as well have been on the moon for all Wade knew of it, Emma Sinclair had been dreaming of exactly this kind of evening when she'd answered Joseph Hartwell's carefully worded advertisement in the St. Louis newspaper. Widowed rancher seeks refined lady companion for marriage and partnership in Kansas territory. Must appreciate simple living and possess a strong constitution. The words had seemed like poetry to a woman who'd spent her 26 years watching the Mississippi River carry other people's dreams toward better lives. Emma had grown up in the floating world of riverboat theaters, where her parents performed Shakespeare for passengers traveling between New Orleans and St. Paul. By the time she was 12, she could recite entire acts of Hamlet and had learned to read people's faces the way other children read picture books. When yellow fever took both her parents during the terrible summer of 1878, Emma found herself alone with nothing but a trunk full of costumes and an education that prepared her for drawing rooms that didn't exist on the frontier. For 8 years, she'd worked as a seamstress in a St. Louis boarding house, mending other women's dreams while her own grew smaller with each passing season. She'd taught herself to decipher coded messages by studying the theatrical ciphers her father had used to communicate with other performers, a skill that had proven useful when helping the boarding house ladies write discreet letters to gentlemen. Callers. Emma had never imagined that particular talent would someday save her life. Joseph Hartwell's letters had arrived like gifts from Providence itself. He wrote of wide skies and endless grasslands, of a home where a woman could plant a thyme, garden and watch it grow without the constant noise and smoke of city life. His penmanship was careful and his words respectful, painting pictures of evening meals shared by lamplight and Sunday. Mornings spent listening to meadowlarks sing. Emma had packed her few belongings with trembling hands, trading her saved coins for a stage ticket and the promise of a future that felt almost too wonderful to believe. The ambush had happened just after sunset, when the stage was still 20 miles from Dry Creek Crossing, and Emma was practicing the words she would say when she first met her intended husband. 3 masked riders had appeared from behind a cluster of cottonwoods, their guns already drawn and their intentions brutally clear. The driver had reached for his shotgun, but never got the chance to use it. Joseph Hartwell, who had ridden out to escort his bride-to-be on the final stretch of her journey, had tried to shield Emma with his own body when the shooting started. Now Emma lay unconscious in a muddy wagon rut, her traveling dress torn and soaked through, her left ankle twisted at an angle that spoke of serious injury. The outlaws had rifled through her trunk, scattering her few precious belongings across the wet grass before galloping away into the gathering darkness. Joseph's body lay 50 yards away, his face turned toward the sky as if he were still watching for the first stars to appear. Wade found them both when his horse shied away from something pale gleaming in the roadside ditch. At first, he thought it was just another lightning-struck tree, bleached white by the elements. Then his lantern caught the waterlogged silk of Emma's dress and the terrible stillness of the man who had died trying to protect her. Wade dismounted quickly, his boots squelching in the saturated earth, as he knelt beside Emma's still form. She was breathing, thank God, but her skin felt cold as marble, and the trickle of blood had dried at the corner of her mouth. When he lifted her gently, checking for broken bones with the careful precision of a man who doctored injured animals, all his life, Emma's eyes fluttered open for just a moment. "Joseph?" she whispered, the word barely audible above the sound of rain pattering against Wade's slicker. "No, ma'am," Wade said softly, his voice gentler than he'd used in years. "Joseph's. I'm sorry, ma'am. He's gone." Emma's eyes closed again, but not before Wade saw something break behind them. Not just the pain of physical injury, but the deeper wound of hope destroyed in a single violent moment. He gathered her carefully in his arms, noting the quality of her dress, despite its bedraggled condition, and the education that showed in her brief, well-spoken question. This was no frontier woman accustomed to hardship. This was someone who had traveled a long way to find a new life, only to have it torn away before it could even begin. The nearest town was Dry Creek Crossing, 8 miles back along the main trail. Wade settled Emma across his saddle and mounted behind her, holding her secure with one arm while guiding his horse through the treacherous footing. The storm was worsening, turning the night into a maze of shifting shadows and wind-driven rain that made every familiar landmark seem strange and threatening. Dry Creek Crossing had seen better days, back when the railroad surveys had suggested the main line might pass through this part of Kansas. Now it was little more than a collection of false-fronted buildings clustered around a single muddy street, home to perhaps 40 souls who were too stubborn or too poor to follow the railroad boom elsewhere. But it had what Wade needed tonight: Doc Morrison's office above the general store, and the small sod chapel where circuit preacher Williams held services when he passed through the territory. Light still burned in the chapel windows when Wade arrived, his horse steaming with exhaustion and Emma's breathing shallow but steady against his chest. Preacher Williams met them at the door, his weathered face creased with concern as he helped Wade carry Emma inside. At 73, Williams had seen enough of frontier violence to recognize its aftermath, but his hands were still gentle as he examined Emma's injuries by the light of flickering candles. Ankles badly twisted, but not broken, he announced after several minutes of careful probing. She's taken a hard knock to the head, and she's soaked through. Exposure might be the worst danger now. Wade stood awkwardly in the small chapel, water dripping from his hat brim as he watched the preacher tend to this woman, who had become his responsibility through no choice of either of them. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating, and Wade knew that the men who had done this might still be somewhere in the darkness, perhaps waiting to finish what they had started. "Preacher," Wade said finally, his voice rough with fatigue and something deeper. "Those men who hurt her, they might come back. And Doc Morrison's gone to Topeka with his wife. There's nowhere safe for her to recover, not without some kind of legal protection." Williams looked up from adjusting the blanket around. Emma's shoulders, understanding passing between the two men like a current of electricity. In the Kansas Territory of 1890, a woman alone was vulnerable in ways that went beyond physical danger. The territorial government was still trying to establish consistent law enforcement, and communities like Dry Creek Crossing often had to create their own solutions to problems that couldn't wait for official help. Emma stirred as they spoke, her eyes opening to focus on Wade's weathered face with surprising clarity. When she tried to sit up, pain shot through her ankle, and she gasped, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Joseph," she said again, and this time it wasn't a question. "I'm sorry," Wade repeated, and he meant it more than he'd meant anything in years. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, Wade saw something he recognized, the look of someone who had lost everything and was trying to decide whether to keep fighting or simply let the current carry them away. It was a look he'd seen in his own mirror, more times than he cared to remember. "I have nowhere to go," Emma whispered, the words barely audible above the sound of rain drumming against the chapel's sod roof in that moment. Wade Jensen made a decision that would change both their lives forever. The torn betrothal contract lay scattered across the chapel floor like the remnants of a broken promise, its official seals and careful penmanship now meaningless in the face of violence. Emma stared at the water-stained papers that had once represented her entire future, watching ink dissolve into meaningless smears as rainwater dripped through a loose board in the roof. The contract had been her proof of respectability, her legal passage into a new life. Now it served only as evidence of murder, and marked her as the sole witness to a crime that could cost her life. Wade knelt beside her, his calloused fingers gentle as he helped her sit upright against the rough wooden pew. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a decision already made, "I know we're strangers, and I know this ain't how either of us pictured this night going. But those men who hurt you, they'll be back. And when they come, they won't leave witnesses." Thunder crashed overhead as if punctuating his words, and the chapel's single-stained glass window rattled in its frame. Emma looked into Wade's weathered face, seeing honesty there, along with something else, a loneliness that matched her own. She thought of the boarding house in St. Louis, of the women who whispered behind closed doors about what happened to females who found themselves alone on the frontier without protection or legal standing. "What are you proposing, Mr. Jensen?" Emma asked, though something in her heart already knew. "Marriage," Wade said simply. "Tonight. Before those killers circle back at dawn." He gestured toward Preacher Williams, who stood near the altar with his prayer book already in hand. "It ain't romantic, and it ain't what either of us planned. But it would give you my name, my roof, and my rifle. And maybe," he paused, hat turning between his nervous fingers, "maybe we could both find something better than loneliness." Emma, studied Wade's face in the candlelight, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of long days under an unforgiving sun and the careful way he held himself ready to protect, but never to presume. In her trunk, somewhere among the scattered belongings, lay a copy of Romeo and Juliet that her mother had given her. But this wasn't a tale of young passion. This was survival, pure and simple, offered by a man who understood what it meant to have nowhere else to turn. "I accept," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. Preacher Williams stepped forward, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he opened his prayer book. At 73, he performed more frontier weddings than he could count, but never one quite like this, born of desperation rather than love, witnessed by lightning instead of family. Still, he'd learned long ago that God worked through circumstances that often made little sense to mortal minds. "Dearly beloved," Williams began, his voice carrying surprising strength in the small chapel, "we are gathered here in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Wade's responses came steady and sure, his eyes never leaving Emma's face as he promised to honor and protect her for as long as they both should live. When Emma spoke her vows, her voice grew stronger with each word, as if the act of making promises was rebuilding something inside her that the violence had nearly destroyed. The thunder that had been building all evening finally broke just as Williams pronounced them husband and wife, rattling the chapel's foundations and sending streams of water through gaps in the sod roof. Wade slipped a simple gold band onto Emma's finger, his mother's ring, saved from the orphan train days and carried in his pocket for 30 years without hope of ever using it. But before the ink could dry on the marriage certificate, the chapel door burst open and 3 men stumbled inside, their clothes dripping and their faces grim with exhaustion. Emma instinctively moved closer to Wade as she recognized Cookie, Dutch, and Slim Wade's ranch hands, their usual cheerful demeanor replaced by urgent concern. "Boss," Cookie gasped, pulling off his soaked hat, "we got trouble riding hard toward the ranch. That storm washed out the creek crossing, and we found sign of at least 6 riders heading up through Willow Canyon. They ain't cattlemen, and they sure ain't traveling honest." Dutch nodded grimly, water streaming from his gray mustache. "Found this too," he said, pulling a leather saddlebag from beneath his slicker. "Caught on some brush near where the creek. Ben's got papers inside that might interest your new missus here." Emma's breath caught as she recognized the saddlebag. It had belonged to Joseph's horse, which must have escaped during the attack. With shaking hands, she opened the bag and found Joseph's personal effects. A few letters, a daguerreotype of an elderly woman who might have been his mother, and a leather portfolio filled with official-looking documents. As Emma spread the papers on the altar, her theater-trained eye immediately caught the inconsistencies that most people would miss. The land deeds were too perfect, the signatures too uniform, the territorial seals slightly wrong in ways that suggested careful forgery. But more telling were the margins of the documents. Where someone had written notes in a cipher, she recognized from her father's theatrical days a simple substitution code that performers used to coordinate complex productions. "They're not just after individual ranches," Emma said, her voice growing stronger as understanding dawned. "This is bigger than that. Look," she pointed to the coded notations. "These numbers correspond to township surveys. They're planning to claim an entire section of territory through forged deeds and manufactured ownership disputes." Wade leaned over her shoulder, his presence both comforting and warming despite the chill of the night. "Can you read those codes?" "Some of them," Emma replied, her fingers tracing the familiar patterns. "My father taught me cipher work when I was 12. This one here." She pointed to a series of numbers and letters along the margin. "It's a timeline. They're moving systematically from ranch to ranch, killing anyone who might contest their claims." Slim spat tobacco juice into a corner and shook his grizzled head. "Means they'll be coming for us next, boss." You're spreads right in the middle of what they're trying to steal. The weight of revelation settled over the small group like a physical presence. This wasn't random violence or simple cattle rustling. The men who had murdered Joseph and left Emma for dead were part of a larger conspiracy to steal an entire region through violence and forgery. And now Emma, with her ability to decipher their codes, represented the biggest threat to their operation. How much time do we have? Wade asked, his hand instinctively moving to the Winchester at his side. Cookie consulted a pocket watch that had somehow survived the storm. Found their sign about 2 hours ago. If they're moving careful like through this weather, probably still 4 or 5 hours before they reach the ranch. Emma looked around the circle of weathered faces, seeing acceptance rather than fear in their expressions. These men had chosen to stand with Wade, and by extension with her, against whatever was coming. The weight of that loyalty was almost overwhelming for someone who had spent most of her life as an outsider looking in. There's more, she said quietly, studying another section of the coded documents. They have inside help. Someone in the territorial government is providing them with advance information about land surveys and ownership records. The implications hung heavy in the storm-filled air. If the conspiracy reached into the territorial administration, then even escape might not guarantee safety. Emma realized that the torn betrothal contract scattered across the chapel floor represented more than her lost dreams. It was evidence of a murder that connected to crimes reaching far beyond this small corner of Kansas. Wade stood slowly, his decision visible in the set of his shoulders. Then we make our stand at the ranch, he said simply. Cookie, how much ammunition do we have? Enough for a good fight, boss. And Dutch brought his scattergun. Emma felt something shift inside her chest, not the fluttering of fear, but the steady burn of determination. These men were willing to risk everything to protect her, and she had skills that might help them survive what was coming. The marriage certificate that Preacher Williams had just signed might have been born of desperation, but it was binding them all together in ways that went far deeper than legal documents. Then we'd better get moving, Emma said, rising to her feet despite the pain in her twisted ankle, because I have a feeling this storm is just getting started. Outside, lightning split the sky like a promise of the battle to come. The journey to Wade's ranch through the storm-lashed Kansas night tested both horse and rider beyond their limits. Emma rode behind Wade on his sturdy gelding, her arms wrapped around his waist for stability as they navigated washouts and flooding. That had transformed familiar trails into treacherous obstacles. The rain had turned to a driving mixture of water and hail that stung exposed skin and made every step forward a victory hard won against the elements. Cookie rode point on his ancient mare, his rain-soaked hat pulled low as he guided them around. The worst of the flooding. Behind them, Dutch and Slim brought up the rear, their rifles ready despite the weather that made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Every few minutes, Cookie would raise his hand to signal a halt, listening for sounds that might indicate pursuit, but the storm swallowed all noise beyond the immediate splash of hooves and the endless drumming of rain. Emma found herself studying the rhythm of Wade's breathing, the steady way he sat his horse despite the brutal conditions, the gentle strength in his hands as he controlled their mount through treacherous footing. This man who had married her out of practical necessity was risking everything to keep her safe, and she barely knew his middle name. Yet something about his quiet competence in the face of danger reminded her of the best leading men her parents had worked with, actors who could project strength and reliability even when the theater was falling down around them. Almost there, Wade said over his shoulder, his voice barely audible above the storm. See that ridgeline? Ranch is just beyond. Emma squinted through the driving rain and could make out a low hill crowned with what might have been buildings. In the intermittent lightning flashes, she caught glimpses of fence posts and the angular shapes of corrals, all of it looking small and vulnerable against the immensity of the storm-swept prairie. Wade's ranch house proved to be a modest structure, built of native stone and weathered timber, with a wide front porch that spoke of evenings spent watching the sunset over endless grassland. Attached to the main house was a kitchen that doubled as common area, and beyond that stood a bunkhouse where the ranch hands normally slept. Everything was built low to the ground and substantial, designed to withstand the fierce winds that could sweep across the plains with little warning. Cookie was first to dismount, his boots splashing in puddles as he led the horses toward the shelter of the barn. "I'll get coffee started," he called, "and see what we got for weapons besides what we're carrying." Dutch and Slim began checking the perimeter immediately, their movements efficient despite their obvious exhaustion. Emma watched them work with growing respect. These men might be aging cowboys, but they moved with the purposeful precision of soldiers. Preparing for battle. Wade helped Emma down from the horse with careful attention to her injured ankle, his hands strong and steady as he supported her weight. "I know it ain't much," he said, gesturing toward the house with what might have been embarrassment. "Built it myself over 10 years, adding rooms as I could afford the lumber." "It's wonderful," Emma said, and meant it. After years in cramped boarding house rooms, the prospect of space and privacy felt like luxury beyond measure. But more than that, she could see evidence of careful craftsmanship in every timber and stone. This was a home built by someone who understood the value of things that lasted. Inside, the main room was dominated by a massive stone fireplace that Cookie was already coaxing to life. The furniture was simple but well made, and Emma noticed details that spoke of a man living alone but trying to maintain some connection to civilization. Books on a shelf near the window, a few photographs in simple frames, even curtains that someone had sewn with care, if not particular skill. Cookie emerged from what was apparently his domain in the kitchen, carrying a battered violin case that looked like it had seen better decades. "Found this in the bunkhouse," he announced with a grin that transformed his weathered face. "Made it myself out of an old cooking pot and some fiddle strings I traded for in Dodge City. Figured if we're gonna have ourselves a proper fight, we might as well have some music to go with it." The incongruity of a musical instrument in the hands of a grizzled ranch cook struck Emma as both absurd and oddly touching. When Cookie opened the case and revealed what was indeed a violin crafted from a large cooking pot, complete with carefully carved tuning pegs and a bow strung with what looked like horsehair, she found herself smiling for the first time since. "The attack. Can you actually play that thing?" she asked. Cookie's grin widened. "Well enough to scare off coyotes and most sensible folks. But it makes a fair signal device, too, when the wind's right. Sound carries for miles out here." Wade had been quietly checking rifles and counting ammunition, but he looked up at Emma's laughter. Cookie used to play for a traveling show before he took up cooking. Got stories that would curl your hair, if you can believe half of them. "All true," Cookie protested, tuning his improvised instrument with surprising skill. "Every word." "No, I might have improved some of the details over the years." Emma found herself drawn into the easy camaraderie among the men, their acceptance of her presence both warming and slightly overwhelming. In the boarding house, she had always been careful to maintain proper distance from the male residents. Here, necessity was breaking down such social barriers with startling speed. Dutch returned from his perimeter check, water streaming from his oilskin coat. No sign of immediate pursuit, but we found fresh horse tracks near the creek crossing. At least 6 riders, moving careful-like through the storm. The mood in the room shifted immediately back to the serious business at hand. Wade spread the coded documents Emma had found on the kitchen table, weighing down the corners with coffee cups to keep them flat. "Show us what you can read," he said simply. Emma studied the papers by lamplight, her theatrical training helping. Her focus, despite the exhaustion and pain that threatened to cloud her thinking. The cipher was more complex than she had initially realized, with multiple layers of meaning embedded in what appeared to be simple land survey notes. Here, she sighed, pointing to a series of numbers along one margin. This isn't just about your ranch. They're targeting 7 properties in a specific sequence, and yours is number 5. Which means they've already hit 4 other spreads. Slim whistled low. That explains why we ain't seen hide nor hair of the Hendersons in 3 weeks. Figured. They'd gone to visit family in Missouri. And the Kramers, Dutch added grimly, found their place empty last month. Thought maybe they'd just pulled up stakes. The weight of revelation settled over the group like a physical presence. They weren't dealing with random violence or simple cattle rustling. The men hunting Emma were part of a systematic campaign of murder and theft that had already claimed multiple victims. Wade stood slowly, his hand resting on the stock of his father's Winchester. Then we make sure they don't get to number 6, he said quietly. Cookie, how's that coffee coming? Strong enough to float a horseshoe, Cookie replied. But his usual cheerfulness was tempered by the gravity of their situation. Emma looked around the circle of weathered faces and realized that she had somehow found herself at the center of something larger than her own survival. These men were preparing to risk their lives not just for her, but for the principle that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the odds. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside Wade's ranch house, a different kind of resolve was building, one that would be tested before the sun rose again. Dawn was still hours away when Wade led Emma to the corral behind the barn, where 3 Mustangs paced restlessly in the confined space. The storm had finally begun to ease, though lightning still flickered on the horizon and the ground remained treacherous with standing water. In the gray pre-dawn light, Emma could see that these weren't the gentle saddle horses she had expected, but half-wild creatures whose eyes showed white when strangers approached. Caught them running loose up in the breaks last spring, Wade explained, his voice soft as he approached the nervous animals. Been working with them slow and steady, but they're still more wild than tame. Figured if things go bad today, we might need horses that can run where others can't. The largest of the 3, a paint stallion with a braided mane that caught the weak morning light, allowed Wade to approach, but kept his ears pinned back in warning. Emma noticed that someone had woven strips of leather and small bones into the horse's mane, in a pattern that seemed both decorative and purposeful. That's Morning Thunder, Wade said, following her gaze. Cookie did the braiding. Says it's an old Cheyenne trick for keeping a horse's spirit strong in battle. Don't know if there's truth to it, but it can't hurt. Emma studied the intricate braiding, recognizing the same attention to symbolic detail that her father had used when preparing for particularly challenging performances. There was something deeply moving about these practical men incorporating ritual and hope into their preparations for violence. Can you teach me to ride one? She asked, surprising herself with the request. Wade looked at her with new respect. It ain't like riding a buggy horse, ma'am. These animals will test you every step of the way. Then they're not so different from theater critics, Emma replied, earning a rare smile from her new husband. The next hour passed in careful instruction as Wade showed Emma the basics of handling the Mustangs. Her twisted ankle made mounting difficult, but once she was seated on the paint's broad back, something in her theater training took over. She had learned long ago to project calm confidence even when terrified, and the Mustang seemed to sense this quality of controlled fear. You've got a natural seat, Wade observed as Emma managed to guide the paint through a series of turns around the corral. Most folks fight the horse's movement instead of working with it. Emma felt a flush of pride at the compliment, but more than that, she was discovering capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. The months of careful, constrained living in the boarding house had hidden strengths that were now emerging under necessity. Cookie appeared at the corral fence carrying a steaming cup of coffee and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. Miss Emma, he said, I've been thinking about them codes you was reading. My old traveling show used to work with some circus folks who had their own ways of passing messages. "Mind if I take a look at them papers?" Back in the kitchen, Emma spread the documents on the table while Cookie adjusted the spectacles he produced. From a vest pocket, his weathered fingers traced the coded notations with surprising delicacy. "Well, I'll be," he murmured after several minutes of study. "This here's what we used to call a layered cipher. See how some of these numbers repeat in patterns? That ain't random, that's coordinates." Emma leaned closer, following Cookie's logic. "Coordinates for what?" "Meeting places, most likely. And timing signals." Cookie pointed to a series of marks that looked like random scratches. "These little marks here, they correspond to moon phases. Whoever's running this operation, they're using the lunar calendar to coordinate their movements." The revelation sent a chill through Emma that had nothing to do with the morning cold. The level of organization suggested resources and planning far beyond what a simple gang of rustlers could manage. Dutch and Slim had been checking weapons and preparing ammunition, but they gathered around the table as Cookie's discoveries became clear. "If they're that well organized," Dutch said grimly, "they might have more men than we figured." Wade studied the papers with growing understanding, but it also means they're predictable. If we can figure out their pattern, we might be able to get ahead of them instead of just reacting. Emma felt her theater training clicking into place like pieces of a complex stage production. "It's all about timing and positioning," she said slowly. "They're not just stealing land, they're putting on a performance. And every performance has weak points where the illusion can fall apart." She began tracing connections between different documents, her father's lessons in dramatic structure, helping her see patterns that others might miss. "Look here, they need the Territorial Surveyor's Office to validate their forged deeds. But the surveyor only comes through this region twice a year, and according to this notation, his next visit is scheduled for next week." The implications were staggering. If the gang could present their forged documents to the Territorial Surveyor as legitimate claims, they would gain legal standing that would be almost impossible to challenge through normal channels. That's why they're moving so fast, Wade realized. They need to clear out all the legitimate owners before the surveyor arrives. Cookie was already moving toward his makeshift violin, his eyes bright with the prospect of action. "Well then, we'd better make sure they don't get the chance." Emma found herself looking around the kitchen at these men who had accepted her so completely into their dangerous enterprise. Wade with his quiet strength and surprising gentleness. Cookie with his bizarre musical talents and unexpected intelligence. Dutch and Slim with their weathered loyalty and steady courage. In less than 12 hours, she had gone from being a homeless victim to being an integral part of something that felt remarkably like family. "There's something else," she said quietly. "I've been thinking about why they left me alive initially. If they're as thorough as these documents suggest, it wasn't an accident." Wade's expression darkened. "What do you mean?" "I think they wanted me to be found. A lone witness, traumatized and unreliable, who could be discredited if she tried to testify against them, but a witness who dies trying to escape." Emma let the implication hang in the air. "Makes their story more believable." Dutch finished grimly. The eastern horizon was beginning to show the first pale hints of dawn, and Emma knew their time for preparation was running short. But instead of fear, she felt a growing sense of determination. These men were willing to risk everything for principles that mattered more than individual survival. She had spent years watching her parents create magic on stage, through careful preparation and absolute trust in their fellow performers. She found herself part of a different kind of performance, one where the stakes were real and the audience was armed and dangerous. But the principles were the same: timing, coordination, and absolute faith in the people standing beside you. Wade checked his father's Winchester one final time, the weapon that represented his only inheritance and his commitment to protecting what mattered. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "we face it together." Emma nodded, feeling the simple gold band on her finger that had made her part of something larger than herself. Outside, morning thunder whinnied softly as if sensing the approaching storm, his braided mane catching the first light of what might be their last dawn. The morning after their desperate wedding brought a peculiar kind of intimacy that neither Wade nor Emma had anticipated. As the first genuine sunlight in 3 days streamed through the kitchen windows, they found themselves sharing coffee and attempting the delicate dance of newlyweds who barely knew each other's habits. Emma discovered that Wade took his coffee black and read his coffee grounds like some men read newspapers, while Wade learned that Emma hummed unconsciously when concentrating, melodies from operas he'd never heard but found oddly comforting. Emma had found a volume of Shakespeare's complete works among Wade's modest library, its pages worn soft from handling. Pressed between the pages of A Midsummer Night's Dream was a single wildflower, dried to papery thinness, but still holding traces of purple color. When she asked about it, Wade's weathered cheeks actually flushed. "Found that the day I signed a deed to this place," he said quietly. "Seemed like a good omen, I suppose. Foolish, maybe, for a grown man to keep such things." Emma studied the delicate pressed bloom, understanding more about her new husband in that moment than all their conversations had revealed. This was a man who noticed beauty in small things, who hoped for more than survival, even when survival itself was uncertain. "It's beautiful," she said simply, carefully replacing the flower between the familiar pages. "My mother used to press flowers in her script books. She said it helped her remember the sweetness in even the saddest stories." The coded documents lay spread across the kitchen table like a puzzle waiting to be solved, and Emma found her theatrical. Training invaluable as she began to decode the gang's operational patterns. Her father had taught her that every successful performance required meticulous attention to entrances, exits, and timing. The outlaw's cipher revealed a similar obsession, with choreographed precision. "They're not just stealing land," she explained to Wade as he cleaned his rifle with methodical care. "They're staging a complete territorial takeover. Look at these patterns. Each ranch they target controls a specific water source or strategic position. Take them all, and you control the movement of cattle and settlers throughout this entire region." Wade paused in his cleaning, understanding the implications immediately. "Which means they'll keep coming, even if we drive them off. We're not just fighting for this ranch. We're fighting for the future of every family trying to build a life out here." The weight of that responsibility settled between them like a physical presence. Emma watched Wade's hands as he reassembled. His weapon, noting the unconscious competence of movements, repeated thousands of times. When he caught her watching, neither looked away. "You don't have to stay," Wade said quietly. "When this is over, I mean. The marriage, it was for protection. I won't hold you to vows made under duress." Emma considered his words while studying. A man who had literally saved her life. He was offering her freedom, even though she could see in his eyes that her departure would cost him dearly. It was an act of generosity that revealed more about his character than any formal courtship could have accomplished. "Where would I go?" she asked. "I have no family, no resources, no connections beyond what I've found here. But more than that." She paused, searching for words that could capture feelings too new and complex for easy expression. "I've spent my entire life watching other people's stories from the wings. Maybe it's time I tried living one of my own." The conversation was interrupted by Cookie's appearance at the kitchen door, his expression unusually serious. "Boss, we got riders coming up the South Trail. Too far to make out details, but they ain't moving like honest folk." Wade was on his feet immediately, his rifle ready, as he moved to the window that offered the best view of the approaching riders. Emma joined him, her heart hammering as she saw the distant figures moving with the purposeful caution of hunters, closing on prey. 6 of them, Wade observed. Same number Cookie counted yesterday. They're being careful, but they're definitely heading this way. Emma studied the riders through the window, her theater training helping her read body language and movement, patterns even at a distance. They're not rushing, she said. They think they have all the time they need. Then we'll have to convince them otherwise, Wade replied grimly. The next hour passed in careful preparation as Wade positioned his men around the ranch buildings with tactical precision that spoke of military experience he'd never mentioned. Dutch took position in the barn loft with his scattergun, while Slim concealed himself behind the water trough with a clear field of fire toward the main approach. Cookie, despite his age, proved surprisingly agile as he climbed onto the roof of the bunkhouse with his improvised violin and a hunting rifle. Emma found herself assigned to the kitchen, where she could monitor the coded documents and coordinate communications between the defenders. Wade had given her a small pistol, his backup weapon, along with hurried instructions on its use. Remember, he said, his hand briefly covering hers, if things go bad, you take Morning Thunder and ride for Dry Creek Crossing. Don't look back. Don't try to help. Just run. But Emma had already made her decision about running. She had spent too many years as a passive observer of other people's courage. If Wade and his men were willing to fight for principles that transcended individual survival, then she would stand with them regardless of the consequences. The riders approached with deliberate slowness, clearly expecting to find the ranch undefended or at most lightly guarded. Their leader, a tall man with a cavalry mustache and the bearing of someone accustomed to command, rode slightly ahead of the others, his hand resting casually on his gun butt. From her position at the kitchen window, Emma could see Wade moving between the buildings with the quiet confidence of a man defending his own ground. There was something almost graceful about the way he positioned himself and his men, creating overlapping fields of fire while maintaining cover. It reminded her of watching her father direct a complex stage production, every movement purposeful, every position calculated for maximum effect. The outlaws stopped just outside rifle range, clearly assessing the ranch's defenses. Their leader called out in a voice trained to carry across distances. Jensen, we know you're in there, and we know you got something that belongs to us. Send out the woman, and maybe we can work out a deal that don't involve anybody getting hurt. Wade's response came from a position Emma couldn't see, his voice steady and implacable. The lady is under my protection now. You got business with her. You'll have to go through me. The outlaw leader's laugh carried clearly in the morning air. That's mighty noble of you, Jensen. But you're just one man with a failing ranch and more debts than cattle. We're offering you a chance to walk away from this. I'm not much for walking away, Wade replied, especially from my own land. Emma felt a surge of pride at her husband's quiet courage, but also a growing understanding of the tactical situation. The outlaws had positioned themselves with clear escape routes while limiting the defenders' options. It was, she realized, very much like a stage drama where the villains controlled the script. But Emma had spent her life learning that every script had weaknesses. Every performance had moments where quick thinking could change the entire outcome. And she was beginning to see possibilities that the outlaws' careful planning had anticipated. Outside, the negotiation was ending as both sides prepared for violence that now seemed inevitable. But Emma was no longer thinking like a victim or even a defender. She was thinking like a director who had just spotted a fatal flaw in the opposing production. Dutch had carved the chess set during the long winter of 1887, when a blizzard had trapped the ranch hands in the bunkhouse for 3 weeks straight. Each piece was a masterwork of patient whittling, the knights shaped like mustangs, the bishops resembling circuit preachers, and the king and queen wearing the stern expressions of frontier settlers who'd seen too much hardship to be easily impressed. Emma discovered the set that afternoon while the outlaws maintained their distant watch, waiting for nightfall to make their move. Dutch made those for his nephew back in Ohio, Wade explained as Emma examined the intricate carved figures. Oi, never wrote back after the first set of letters, so Dutch just kept the chess set. Figured maybe someday the boy would come west and they could play a game or two. The story touched something deep in Emma's chest, another reminder of the profound loneliness that seemed to haunt every person on this frontier. Men like Dutch and Wade had built their lives around hope that someone, someday, would share their carefully tended spaces and simple treasures. "Do you play?" Emma asked, setting up the pieces with hands that trembled only slightly. Wade's smile carried a hint of embarrassment. "Cookie taught me the basics, but I ain't much for strategy. Too used to solving problems with direct action, I suppose." As they played, Emma found herself studying not just the board, but the man across from her. Wade approached chess the same way he seemed to approach everything else, with careful consideration and absolute commitment to each decision. He might not have formal education in tactics, but he understood the value of protecting important pieces and the necessity of sacrifice for larger gains. "The outlaws made a mistake," Emma said as she moved her queen to threaten Wade's king. "They're treating this like a simple robbery, but they're actually playing a much more complex game." Wade studied the board, seeing the trap she'd laid for. "His pieces? How do you mean?" "They need us alive long enough to sign over the deed," Emma explained. "Dead men can't transfer property legally, and they need legitimate paperwork for their territorial surveyor. But they also need the transfer to look voluntary, which means they have to break us psychologically before they kill us." The implications were chilling, but they also represented opportunity. Emma had decoded enough of the gang's communications to understand their operational pattern. They were methodical rather than impulsive, which meant they could be predicted and potentially manipulated. Wade made his move on the chessboard, sacrifice that saved his king, but cost him his most powerful rook. "So we make them think they're winning until we're ready to spring our own trap." "Exactly," Emma said, but something in her voice must have revealed deeper concern, because Wade looked up from the board with sharp attention. "What is it?" Emma hesitated, then decided that honesty was the only foundation for whatever they were building together. "I'm afraid," she admitted quietly, "not just of dying, but of this ending before I understand what it could become." Wade's weathered hand covered hers across the chessboard, his touch gentle but sure. "You mean us. I mean everything. This place, these people who've accepted me so completely, the feeling that I might finally belong somewhere." Emma's voice grew stronger as she continued. "I've spent my entire life on the periphery of other people's stories. My parents' theater, the boarding house, even my journey here to marry Joseph. I was always the supporting character, never the heroine of my own tale." Wade studied her face in the lamplight, seeing something there that made his own expression soften. "And now?" "Now I'm terrified that when the danger passes, I'll discover this was all just another performance. That you married me out of pity, and that whatever kindness you've shown was just good manners extended to a woman in distress." The honesty of her confession hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Wade was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "Emma," he said finally, "I've lived alone on this ranch for 15 years. Built every fence post, delivered every calf, and spent more evenings talking to my horse than to another human being. When I found you in that wagon rut, broken and bleeding, something in my chest just unlocked, like a door I'd forgotten existed had suddenly swung open." He paused, clearly struggling with words that didn't come easily to a man more accustomed to action than emotional declarations. "I didn't marry you out of pity," he continued. "I married you because for the first time in my adult life, I could. Imagine sharing this place with someone who might actually want to stay. The danger, the circumstances, they just gave me the courage to ask for something I'd stopped believing I deserved." Emma felt tears threaten, but they were tears of relief rather than sorrow. "Even if I'm not the wife you would have chosen under different circumstances?" Wade's smile transformed his entire face. "Darling, You're exactly the wife I would have been too scared to dream of choosing. Their first argument came 2 hours later, when Emma announced her intention to be part of the active defense rather than hiding in the kitchen while the men fought. Wade's protective instincts warred with his growing respect for Emma's capabilities, creating a tension that neither had anticipated. "It's not about your courage," Wade said, his voice carefully controlled. "It's about tactics. We need you alive to decode their communications and coordinate our response. And I need to be where I can actually see what's happening," Emma replied, with equal firmness. "You can't defend against something you don't understand, and I understand these men better than anyone else here." Cookie interrupted their debate by appearing in the kitchen doorway with his violin case and a grin that suggested he'd been eavesdropping. "If you two are done arguing about who gets to risk their neck, we got movement out there. Looks like our guests are getting ready for the evening festivities." The outlaws had spent the day in careful reconnaissance, positioning themselves around the ranch buildings with the patience of experienced hunters. Emma could see them through the window-dark shapes moving between cover points, testing the defenders' alertness and mapping their fields of fire. "They're being too careful," she observed. "Professional soldiers would have attacked hours ago. These men are used to easier prey," Wade nodded grimly, "which means they'll make mistakes when things don't go according to their usual pattern." Dutch appeared from the barn, moving with surprising stealth for his age. "Boss, they got someone," circling around toward the creek. "Looks like they're planning a two-pronged attack." The strategic discussion that followed revealed the depth of experience among Wade's men. Despite their advanced years and civilian status, Dutch and Slim had both served in the territorial militias, while Cookie's traveling show background had taught him valuable lessons about reading crowds and anticipating trouble. Emma found herself contributing insights based on her understanding of the outlaws' coded communications. Their operational pattern suggested a preference for psychological pressure over direct assault. They wanted their victims demoralized and broken before the final confrontation. "Then we don't give them the performance they're expecting," Emma said, her theater training clicking into place. "We make them improvise, force them to react instead of following their script." Wade looked at his wife with growing admiration. In less than 24 hours, she had transformed from a traumatized victim into a strategic thinker whose insights were proving invaluable. But more than that, she was becoming the center around which their small community was organizing itself. "What do you have in mind?" he asked. Emma's smile carried echoes of her parents' theatrical brilliance. "Every good drama needs a plot twist the audience doesn't see coming. And I think it's time we gave our uninvited guests a surprise they'll never forget." Outside, the outlaws continued their careful positioning, unaware that the woman they thought of as helpless prey was about to rewrite the script of their carefully planned operation. The chess game sat forgotten on the kitchen table, its carved pieces frozen in mid-battle, like soldiers waiting for orders that would determine the fate of everyone in their small frontier kingdom. As darkness gathered over the Kansas hills, Emma began to explain her plan, a strategy that would require perfect timing, absolute trust, and the kind of courage that transforms ordinary people into legends. Emma's hands shook as she opened Joseph Hartwell's leather satchel for the third time. But this examination was different from her previous searches. She was no longer looking for the obvious documents and personal effects. She was searching for the kinds of hidden compartments and secret pockets that performers used to conceal valuables during travel. Her father had taught her that the most important things were always hidden in plain sight. The sheriff's badge was sewn into the lining of the satchel's back panel, invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look and how to feel for the telltale stiffness of metal beneath leather. But it was more than just a badge. It was a complete set of credentials, identifying Joseph Hartwell as Deputy U.S. Marshal Joseph Hartwell, operating under deep cover for the Federal Bureau of Investigation into Territorial Land Fraud. Wade whistled low as Emma spread the hidden documents across the kitchen table. Sweet Jesus, your intended wasn't just a rancher looking for a wife. He was investigating the same gang that killed him, Emma said, her voice hollow with the implications. And I was. I was his cover story. The perfect disguise for a federal agent who needed to blend into frontier society without raising suspicions. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Joseph's carefully worded letters, his knowledge of local land disputes, even his timing in meeting her stage, everything had been calculated to maintain his cover identity. Emma realized she had never been traveling toward a genuine marriage proposal, but toward an elaborate federal investigation that had cost Joseph his life. Cookie leaned over the documents, his weathered finger tracing lines of official text. Says here he was part of something called Operation Territorial Justice, been tracking this land grab scheme for 8 months, reporting directly to territorial headquarters in Topeka. Dutch shook his head grimly. No wonder they killed him so clean. Professional job, that was. They knew exactly who they were dealing with. But Emma was studying another document, a detailed map showing not just the 7 ranches she had identified earlier, but dozens of properties throughout 3 counties. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, involving forged deeds, murdered homesteaders, and what appeared to be the systematic theft of nearly 100,000 acres of prime territorial land. This isn't just about controlling a region, she said slowly. They're preparing for statehood. When Kansas becomes a state, whoever controls this much land will have enormous political power. They could determine territorial representatives, influence state constitutional conventions, even control railroad development rights. Wade absorbed the implications in silence, understanding dawning in his weathered face. Which means they've got backing from people with serious money and political connections. More than that, Emma said, pointing to a series of coded notations along the map's borders. According to Joseph's notes, there are territorial officials involved at the highest levels. The territorial surveyor isn't just being manipulated, he's part of the conspiracy. The weight of revelation settled over the kitchen like a suffocating blanket. They weren't facing a gang of opportunistic outlaws, but a sophisticated criminal organization with resources and connections that reached into the territorial government itself. The men surrounding their ranch were merely the violent enforcers of a much larger operation. Slim appeared in the kitchen doorway, his expression urgent. "Boss, we got bigger problems. Just spotted smoke signals from Pine Ridge, that's Cheyenne country, about 15 miles north. Either there's trouble with the tribes, or somebody's using Indian signals to coordinate movements." Emma studied Joseph's hidden documents with growing understanding. "They're not just using the lunar calendar," she said. "They're coordinating with tribal allies. Look at these payment records, regular deliveries of rifles and ammunition to Cheyenne bands in exchange for intelligence and safe passage." The tactical situation had just become exponentially more complex. If the outlaws had tribal allies providing reconnaissance and coordination, then the isolated ranch was facing potentially overwhelming odds. Wade stood slowly, his hand moving instinctively to his father's Winchester. How long before those signals bring reinforcements? According to the signal patterns in Joseph's notes, Emma said, probably 2 or 3 hours. Long enough for the gang to pin us down while their allies move into position. Cookie had been uncharacteristically quiet during the revelations, but now he spoke with the authority of someone who had spent years reading crowds and anticipating trouble. "We can't fight that many men, boss. Not with what we got here. And we don't fight them," Emma said quietly. "We expose them." The plan that emerged from Emma's theatrical training was audacious in its simplicity. Instead of waiting for the attack, they would use Joseph's federal credentials and evidence to turn the hunters into the hunted. But it would require perfect timing and the kind of deception that could only succeed if every participant played their role with absolute conviction. Joseph was supposed to rendezvous with territorial authorities tomorrow morning, Emma explained, studying his hidden schedule. Federal marshals and territorial prosecutors, all gathering in Dry Creek Crossing to coordinate the final phase of their investigation. If we can reach them with this evidence, they'll be walking into a trap, Wade finished. The gang will be expecting them. Exactly. But if the gang thinks their plan is proceeding on schedule, they won't be prepared for federal intervention arriving 12 hours early. Emma's eyes bright with the kind of strategic thinking that her father had used to orchestrate complex dramatic productions. Wade studied his wife with growing admiration and something deeper, a recognition that he had found not just a partner, but an equal whose intelligence complemented his own practical skills in ways he was only beginning to understand. It's risky, he said finally, if we're wrong about the timing, or if the federal people don't believe us. Then we're no worse off than we are right now, Emma replied. But if we're right, we might save not just ourselves, but every honest settler in 3 counties. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. They would split their forces. Wade and Dutch would hold the ranch and maintain the appearance of normal defensive preparations, while Emma and Cookie made a desperate night ride to Dry Creek Crossing with Joseph's evidence and credentials. I should be the one riding to town, Wade protested, but Emma shook her head firmly. Joseph's credentials identify me as his wife. The federal marshals will be more likely to believe a widow carrying her dead husband's evidence than a stranger with a story about finding documents. She paused, meeting Wade's concerned gaze steadily. Besides, you're needed here. If the timing goes wrong, this ranch is the only defensible position for miles. Cookie was already preparing his travel gear with the efficiency of someone who had spent years moving quickly between towns. That paint horse of yours will carry double, he told Emma. And I know every back trail between here and Dry Creek Crossing. As they prepared for the dangerous ride through hostile territory, Emma felt the weight of Joseph's badge in her hands. Not just a piece of metal, but a symbol of the justice that he had died trying to achieve. She had become, in a way she never could have anticipated, the final witness to his investigation and the key to exposing the conspiracy that had claimed his life. Wade helped her mount Morning Thunder in the pre-dawn darkness, his hands lingering on her waist longer than strictly necessary. Come back to me, he said quietly. We got too much unfinished business for you to go getting yourself killed. Emma leaned down to kiss him, their first kiss as husband and wife, born not of passion, but of partnership and the shared understanding that they were fighting for something larger than themselves. Take care of our home, she whispered against his lips. Then Cookie was leading her into the darkness, following deer trails and creek beds that would keep them hidden from the outlaw surveillance. Behind them, Wade and his remaining men prepared to maintain the illusion that nothing had changed, while ahead lay the desperate gamble that would determine the fate of everyone they had come to love. As Morning Thunder carried her through the Kansas night, Emma clutched Joseph's federal credentials and felt the weight of responsibility that came with being the sole surviving witness to a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. She was no longer just a mail-order bride, or even a woman fighting for survival. She had become the instrument of justice itself. Emma's wedding ring caught the first pale light of dawn as she removed it from her finger, polishing the simple gold band with trembling hands until it gleamed like a tiny mirror. Cookie watched her preparations with the understanding of someone who had spent years coordinating complex stage productions, recognizing the careful attention to detail that could mean the difference between triumph and disaster. Signal mirror, he said approvingly. Your daddy teach you that trick too? Theater lighting, Emma replied, angling the ring to catch and redirect the early sunlight. Sometimes you need to put light exactly where the audience isn't expecting. She secured the ring to a length of thread that would allow her to use it for long-distance communication with Wade. Their final contingency plan, if everything else went wrong. They had reached the outskirts of Dry Creek Crossing, just as the territorial clock tower chimed 5 in the morning. Their desperate night ride through creek beds and deer trails having, brought them safely past the outlaw surveillance network. Cookie's knowledge of the hidden paths had proven invaluable, guiding them around ambush points and keeping them moving when Emma's injured ankle threatened to slow their progress. The federal marshals were already waiting in the chapel, where Emma and Wade had spoken their vows just 36 hours earlier. Marshal James Crawford was a lean, gray-haired man whose weathered face spoke of decades spent enforcing law in places where official authority often meant little more than the badge in his pocket. His 2 deputies flanked him like seasoned hunting dogs, their hands never far from their weapons, as they listened to Emma's account of Joseph's murder and the conspiracy it had uncovered. "Mrs. Jensen," Crawford said carefully, examining Joseph's hidden credentials with the thoroughness of someone who had seen too many forged documents. "These papers appear genuine, but you understand the gravity of what you're alleging. Territorial. Officials involved in land fraud, systematic murder of federal officers, conspiracy involving tribal eyes. These are charges that could destabilize the entire statehood process." Emma met his gaze steadily, drawing on her theatrical training to project the kind of calm authority that commanded attention. "Marshal, my husband died trying to gather this evidence. I've decoded enough of their communications to know they're planning to present forged deeds to the territorial surveyor next week. If you don't act now, they'll have legal standing that will take years to challenge in court." Crawford's expression remained skeptical until Emma spread the decoded map across the altar, showing the full scope of the conspiracy. The sheer audacity of attempting to steal nearly 100,000 acres of prime, territorial land finally convinced him that the threat was real. "All right, Mrs. Jensen, we'll investigate. But I need you to understand that if you're wrong about any of this, the consequences will fall heavily on everyone involved." "And if I'm right," Emma replied quietly, "the consequences of not acting will fall on every honest settler trying to build a life in Kansas territory." Cookie had been studying the chapel's layout with the eye of someone planning a complex performance. "Marshal," he said, "begging your pardon, but we got tactical considerations that need addressing. The gang's expecting to ambush federal officers arriving on schedule this afternoon. If we move now, while they're still positioning themselves around the Jensen ranch, we might catch them in their own trap." Crawford nodded slowly, beginning to appreciate the strategic opportunity. "How many men are we talking about?" 6 outlaws confirmed, Emma said, but they've got tribal allies providing reconnaissance and coordination. Could be 20 or 30. Fighters once the smoke signals bring reinforcements. The marshal's deputies exchanged glances that spoke of battles fought in similar circumstances. "We've dealt with worse odds," the older deputy said grimly. "But we'll need local support and someone who knows the terrain." Cookie stepped forward with a grin that transformed his weathered face. "Well, Marshal, happens I know every rock and creek bed between here and the ranch, and I got a feeling the whole town's been waiting for a chance to clean out these land-grabbing varmints." The next hour passed in careful coordination as Crawford's federal authority combined with local knowledge to create a tactical plan that might actually succeed. Emma found herself at the center of the planning, her decoded intelligence providing crucial insights into the outlaws' positions and timing. But even as they prepared for battle, Emma's thoughts kept returning to Wade and the men defending the ranch. Her husband would be positioning his limited forces for a siege, unaware that federal help was finally coming. The signal mirror secured to her wedding ring might be their only way to coordinate the converging attacks. Dr. Morrison had returned from Topeka during the night, bringing with him news that added urgency to their mission. "Territorial Surveyor's office has been compromised," he reported grimly. "Word is that survey schedules have been leaked to parties unknown, and there's concern about the validity of recent land transactions." Crawford absorbed this information with the expression of a man watching pieces fall into place on a chessboard. "Which means the conspiracy reaches higher than we thought. We're not just dealing with local criminals. We're looking at territorial-level corruption." Emma studied. The federal marshal, recognizing the careful calculation in his weathered features. Crawford was weighing political considerations against law enforcement necessities, trying to determine how much official support he could count on if the investigation revealed corruption among his own superiors. "Marshal," she said quietly, "Joseph died believing that justice was worth more than political convenience. The question is whether you believe the same thing." Crawford's smile was grim but genuine. "Mrs. Jensen, I've been wearing this badge for 23 years. If I was worried about political convenience, I'd have found a different line of work." The ride back toward the ranch began just as the sun cleared the horizon, casting long shadows across the grassland that would provide cover for their approach. Emma rode beside Crawford, her signal mirror ready and her heart hammering, with the knowledge that everything depended on perfect timing and a level of coordination that would challenge even experienced military units. Cookie had recruited 6 townsmen to supplement Crawford's deputies' men, whose own property and families were threatened by the land-grabbing conspiracy. They rode with the grim determination of settlers who had seen too many neighbors disappear and too many legitimate claims disputed by mysterious legal challenges. As they approached the ridge overlooking Wade's ranch, Emma could see smoke signals rising from multiple points on the northern horizon. The outlaws' tribal allies were moving into position exactly as Joseph's intercepted communications had predicted. But instead of finding federal officers arriving on schedule for an ambush, they would discover a coordinated attack from multiple directions. Emma positioned herself on the highest point of the ridge, where her signal mirror could reach Wade's position near the ranch house. The first flash of reflected sunlight brought an immediate response. 3 brief flashes from eyes. What appeared to be a piece of polished metal near the barn. Wade had received the signal and was ready. Crawford studied the ranch layout through field glasses, noting the outlaws' positions with professional interest. "They're good," he admitted. "Professional positioning, coordinated fields of fire, escape routes planned. These aren't just hired thugs. They're military," Emma said, remembering details from Joseph's notes. "Ex-cavalry, discharged after the Indian campaigns ended. They know exactly what they're doing." "Then we'll have to be better," Crawford replied grimly. The attack began with Cookie's violin, its harsh notes carrying across the morning air in a melody that sounded like a cavalry charge played on a kitchen pot. The signal brought immediate response from the outlaws, who opened fire on what they assumed was a diversionary tactic from the surrounded ranch defenders. Cookie's music was actually the signal for a coordinated assault from 3 directions. Crawford's. Federal officers attacking from the east, the townsmen moving in from the south, and Wade's ranch hands breaking out of their defensive positions to create chaos in the outlaws' carefully planned siege. Emma watched the battle unfold through her field glasses, her wedding ring flashing signals to coordinate the various groups. As the morning air filled with gunsmoke and the sharp crack of rifles, for the first time since Joseph's murder, she felt hope that justice might actually be possible. But even as federal authority finally arrived to clean up the conspiracy, Emma knew that the real victory was already won. She had found her place in the world, not as someone else's supporting character, but as the heroine of her own story, a woman who had transformed from victim to victor through courage, intelligence, and the unexpected love of a lonely cowboy who had offered her shelter in the storm. The battle for Wade's ranch was about to determine the fate of territorial justice, but Emma Jensen had already won the fight for her own future. The lightning-split oak branch lay where the storm had deposited it 3 nights earlier, its jagged end hardened by fire and weather into something resembling a primitive spear. Wade had noticed it while positioning his men for the dawn assault. And now, as the outlaws' leader charged toward the ranch house with murder in his eyes, the broken branch became an instrument of frontier justice. The attack had begun exactly as Emma's signal mirror indicated, with Cookie's violin screeching its cavalry charge across the morning air. But the outlaws had responded faster than expected, their military training evident, as they immediately recognized the coordinated nature of the assault and began fighting their way toward predetermined rally points. Wade's first shot from his father's Winchester dropped the outlaw, trying to flank the barn, the man's rifle spinning away into the mud as Dutch's scattergun boomed from the loft above. But the gang's leader, the tall man with the cavalry mustache, who had done most of the talking yesterday, was cutting directly through the defensive perimeter with the single-minded purpose of someone who understood that eliminating the opposition's command structure was the key to victory. From her position on the ridge, Emma watched through field glasses as her husband abandoned his covered position to engage the gang leader in direct combat. She wanted to signal a warning, but Wade was already moving with the fluid grace of someone who had learned violence in harder schools than most men ever attended. The lightning-split oak branch caught the gang leader completely by surprise. He had expected to face a farmer with a rifle, not a man who could improvise weapons from the landscape itself. Wade's swing with the fire-hardened wood knocked the outlaw's pistol spinning away, the impact driving him backward toward the corral, where Morning Thunder and the other Mustangs paced nervously. "You picked the wrong ranch, friend," Wade said quietly. The oak branch balanced in his hands like a quarterstaff. The gang leader's response was a cavalry saber that seemed to appear from nowhere, its blade catching the morning light as he lunged forward with the trained precision of someone who had learned swordplay in military academies. But Wade had learned fighting in places where survival depended on using whatever came to hand, and the lightning-split oak proved surprisingly effective at turning aside steel. Around them, the battle raged with increasing intensity. Marshall Crawford's federal officers had engaged the outlaws' eastern flank, while the townsmen from Dry Creek Crossing pressed in from the south. Cookie had abandoned his violin for his rifle, and his shots from the bunkhouse roof were proving devastatingly accurate. But it was Dutch's scattergun that created the tactical breakthrough Wade needed. The old cowhand's blast caught two outlaws trying to flank the corral, driving them back toward the creek where Slim waited with his hunting rifle. The sudden collapse of their left flank forced the remaining outlaws to cluster around their leader, creating exactly the kind of target concentration that Cookie had been waiting for. The improvised violin case made an unexpectedly effective shield as Cookie slid down from the roof, using the pot metal construction to deflect bullets while he positioned himself for clear shots. His war whoop, learned from Comanche traders in his traveling show days, added an element of psychological warfare that clearly rattled men accustomed to intimidating their opponents. Wade pressed his advantage with the oak branch, driving the gang leader back toward the corral fence, where the Mustang's nervous energy was building toward panic. Morning Thunder's eyes showed white as gunfire erupted around him, his braided mane whipping as he fought against the rope halter that kept him contained. "Your operation's finished," Wade told the gang leader, blocking another saber thrust with the fire-hardened wood. "Federal marshals got your whole conspiracy mapped out, thanks to the woman you thought you'd killed." The outlaw's expression shifted from confidence to desperation as he realized that their carefully planned operation had been compromised at the highest levels. "That theater bitch was supposed to die with her husband," he snarled, pressing his attack with renewed fury. Wade's response was delivered with the oak branch, a sweeping blow that caught the saber blade and snapped it off 6 inches from the hilt. The gang leader staggered backward, his primary weapon reduced to an oversized knife, while Wade advanced with the patient determination of someone defending his own ground. From the ridge, Emma watched her husband fight with a mixture of pride and terror that made her hands shake as she maintained signal contact with Crawford's advancing officers. The federal coordination was working. The outlaws were being systematically surrounded, and their escape routes cut off, but individual battles still hung in the balance. Cookie's violin case finally gave way under repeated gunfire. But by then, He had positioned himself behind the water trough, with clear shots at the remaining outlaws. His hunting rifle spoke with methodical precision, each shot carefully aimed and devastatingly effective, but the gang leader's final desperate charge carried him directly into Wade's prepared defense. The lightning-split oak branch meeting cavalry, training with frontier pragmatism. When the dust settled, justice had been served by a weapon forged by the same storm that had brought Emma to the man who would become her salvation. But the battle was only half won, and the most dangerous moments still lay ahead. The territorial land deed that the gang leader pulled from his jacket was a masterpiece of forgery, complete with official seals and signatures that would have fooled anyone who hadn't spent years studying theatrical props and stage illusions. But Emma had learned to recognize fraudulent documents during her father's productions, where fake letters and forged contracts were essential elements of dramatic plot development. The gang leader backed toward the ranch house, his remaining men falling around him as Crawford's federal officers closed the tactical circle. In desperation, he waved the forged deed like a shield, shouting about legal ownership and legitimate land claims, even as his conspiracy collapsed in gunfire and chaos. "This ranch belongs to the Territorial Development Corporation," he yelled, his voice cracking with the strain of a man watching his carefully planned operation disintegrate. "We got papers, signed and sealed by territorial authorities." Wade advanced steadily, the lightning-split oak branch still ready in his hands despite the outlaw's attempt to hide behind legal documents. "Papers don't mean much when they're signed with dead men's blood," he replied grimly, but Emma could see through her field glasses that the gang leader was maneuvering toward the ranch house for a reason. Her theatrical instincts recognized the signs of a desperate final gambit, someone positioning themselves for a dramatic last act that would either salvage their defeat or destroy everything they couldn't control. The signal mirror flashed urgent warnings across the distance, but Wade was focused on the immediate threat and didn't catch her attempts at communication. Emma made a decision that would have terrified her 48 hours earlier, but now felt like the natural response of someone who had found her place in the world. She spurred morning thunder down the ridge, riding hard toward the ranch house, while Crawford's men maintained their coordinated assault on the remaining outlaws. Cookie saw her coming and shifted his rifle to provide covering fire, his shots creating a corridor of safety through the chaos of the final battle. Emma reached the ranch house just as the gang leader kicked in the kitchen door, his injured desperation making him more dangerous than ever. The forged deed fluttered in his trembling hands as he searched frantically for something that might salvage his position, or at least guarantee that his enemies would share his defeat. "Mrs. Jensen," he said when Emma appeared in the doorway, his pistol now trained on the kerosene lamp that provided light for the kitchen table. "How nice of you to join your husband for the finale." Emma recognized the tactical situation immediately. Gang leader was threatening to burn down the ranch house, destroying not only Wade's home, but also the evidence of the conspiracy that could bring justice for Joseph's murder and prevent future crimes. But Emma had spent her childhood watching her parents diffuse dramatic tensions through careful psychology and perfect timing. She understood that desperate people often made fatal mistakes when their attention was divided between multiple threats. "That deed won't help you," she said quietly, moving slowly into the kitchen while keeping her hands visible. "I've already decoded your entire operation. Federal marshals have copies of every document, every coded communication, every piece of evidence needed to prosecute the conspiracy." The gang leader's laugh was bitter and desperate. "Maybe so, but without this ranch as a base of operations, your husband won't last the winter. And without you as a witness, the federal case becomes a lot harder to prove." Emma felt the weight of Wade's father's pistol in her pocket, the backup weapon he had given her with hurried instructions about its use. But her theatrical training suggested a different approach to this final confrontation. "You're right about one thing," she said, continuing her careful advance into the kitchen. "This ranch means everything to Wade. It represents 15 years of work, hope for the future, dreams of building something lasting." "Then you understand why I'm willing to burn it all down," the gang leader replied, his finger tightening on the pistol trigger. "But you're wrong about something else," Emma continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm not just a witness to your crimes. I'm the proof that your entire operation was doomed from the beginning." The gang leader's expression shifted toward confusion as Emma reached the kitchen table where the chess set still sat from her game with Wade, her fingers closed around the carved queen. Dutch's masterwork of patient whittling that had been intended as a gift for a nephew who never wrote back. "You see," Emma said, lifting the carved piece with theatrical precision, "you made the same mistake that every amateur makes when they try to direct a complex production. You assumed that everyone else would stick to your script." The distraction was exactly what Wade needed. He appeared in the kitchen doorway like a force of nature, the lightning-split oak branch moving with lethal precision to disarm the gang leader before he could carry out his final threat. The forged deed fluttered to the floor as justice finally caught up with men who had turned murder into a business plan. Marshal Crawford's voice carried across the morning air, announcing the capture of the remaining outlaws and the successful conclusion of Operation Territorial Justice. But Emma barely heard the official pronouncements. She was focused on Wade's arms around her, on the solid reality of survival and justice, and on the future they could now build together without fear. The chess queen lay forgotten on the kitchen floor, its carved features serene despite the violence that had swirled around it. Like the ranch itself, it had endured through careful craftsmanship and patient hope, qualities that would define whatever came next for the unlikely couple. Had found love in the midst of frontier justice. 3 months later, Wade Jensen stood in his workshop with wood shavings curling around his boots, carefully carving letters into a piece of seasoned oak that would become the new sign for the ranch. The words Jensen Ranch, Wade and Emma, Est, 1890, took shape under his patient knife work, each letter formed with the same attention to detail that had built every fence post and stone foundation on the property. The territorial government's investigation had concluded 2 weeks earlier, with indictments reaching all the way to the surveyor's office in Topeka. Emma's testimony, supported by Joseph Hartwell's meticulous federal documentation, had exposed a conspiracy that involved 12 territorial officials and resulted in the recovery of nearly 80,000 acres of stolen land. The reward money substantial enough to pay off the ranch's debts and fund improvements for years to come sat in the Dry Creek Crossing Bank, earning interest while Wade and Emma planned their future. But the real transformation wasn't financial. It was visible in the way Emma moved through the ranch house as if she had lived there all her life, hanging curtains she had sewn herself and arranging furniture with an eye for both comfort and beauty. Cookie had taught her to cook frontier meals that could sustain working men through long days, while she had introduced the ranch hands to evening readings from Shakespeare that they pretended to endure but secretly enjoyed. The sound of hoofbeats announced Emma's return from Dry Creek Crossing, where she had been working with Marshal Crawford to finalize the last details of the federal case. Wade looked up from his carving to see his wife dismounting from mourning, thunder with the easy grace of someone who had mastered frontier horsemanship through necessity and determination. "Any word from the territorial prosecutors?" Wade asked, setting down his carving knife to help Emma with the supplies she had brought from town. "All charges filed and sealed," Emma replied, her smile carrying the satisfaction of justice finally served. "Crawford says it's the largest land fraud case in territorial history. Joseph's investigation will save hundreds of families from losing their homesteads." She paused beside Wade's workbench to examine the ranch sign, running her fingers over the carved letters with obvious pleasure. "It's beautiful," she said softly, "though I still can't quite believe this is real sometimes." Wade studied his wife's face, noting the way 3 months of frontier life had brought color to her cheeks and confidence to her bearing. The frightened woman he had found bleeding in a wagon rut had transformed into someone who could handle Mustangs, decode criminal conspiracies, and coordinate federal investigations with equal competence. "Feels real to me," he said, capturing her hand in his and noting the calluses that had formed from ranch work. "Especially when you're humming opera while feeding chickens." Emma's laughter was rich with contentment. "Mother always said that music made every task easier, though I doubt she imagined me applying that lesson to gathering eggs." The evening rain began as they walked toward the house together, but this time the precipitation brought relief rather than terror. The drought had finally broken, and the Kansas grassland was responding with the kind of spring growth that promised excellent grazing and successful cattle seasons ahead. Dutch had already reported that several neighboring ranchers were interested in purchasing breeding stock, while Slim had begun negotiations to expand their herd with cattle from Texas drovers. Inside the ranch house, Cookie was preparing dinner, while entertaining Dutch and Slim with increasingly elaborate stories about his traveling show days. The violin made from a cooking pot sat in a place of honor above the fireplace, its improvised construction somehow more beautiful than any factory-made instrument could have been. "Mrs. Jensen," Cookie announced with theatrical formality, "I got word from my nephew in Ohio today. Seems he's finally decided to come west and try his hand at ranching. Wondered if you might know of any spreads that could use a young man with more enthusiasm than experience." Emma exchanged glances with Wade, both understanding the deeper meaning of Cookie's news. The old cowboy had finally received the letter he had been hoping for during all those years of patient waiting. "I think we might be able to find him something," Wade said with studied casualness. "Been thinking we could use help with the horse training program Emma's been developing." The conversation continued over dinner, but Emma found her attention drifting to the window where rain traced silver patterns down the glass. 3 months ago, she had been a homeless woman with no prospects beyond an arranged marriage to a stranger. Now she was integral to a functioning ranch operation, respected by federal marshals for her investigative abilities, and married to a man who valued her intelligence as much as her companionship. After the others had retired to the bunkhouse, Wade and Emma sat before the fireplace with coffee and the chess set that had become their evening ritual. The carved pieces seemed to glow in the lamplight, each figure representing the patient craftsmanship that created lasting beauty from simple materials. "Wade," Emma said as she moved her queen to threaten his king, "what would you have done if the drought hadn't broken? If the ranch had failed, despite everything we went through?" Wade studied the chessboard, but his attention was really on the woman who had transformed his lonely existence into something resembling a fairy tale. "I suppose we would have found another way to build a life together," he said finally. "Maybe. Headed further west, or tried our hand at one of those railroad boom towns. As long as we were together?" "As long as we were together," Wade confirmed, moving his king to safety with a smile that transformed his weathered features. Outside, the gentle rain continued its promise of renewal and growth, washing away the last traces of the violence that had brought them together, while nourishing the seeds of whatever they would build in the seasons ahead. The ranch sign lay waiting in Wade's workshop, ready to announce to the world that some marriages forged in desperation can become the strongest foundations for love. Emma Jensen fell asleep that night, listening to rain on the roof and her husband's steady breathing beside her, finally understanding that she had found not just shelter from the storm, but the home she had been searching for all her life without knowing it existed. In the morning, they would hang the new sign and begin another day of building their future together, one fence post and one shared dream at a time.